Book 5. A Mirza in a Mulberry Tree. Partisans, guerrillas, national volunteers who fight against occupation forces on territory usurped by the enemy and who rely upon extensive support from the local population. The Soviet Dictionary of Basic Military Terms, Moscow. 1. Hang the bandit scum. Kabul and Panjshir Valley, Afghanistan, June 9th. Comrade General, this Afghan assignment is the most interesting experience of my life. There's much of detailed value to us here, far more even than I saw in Egypt. Major Bakunin's eyes gleamed behind his spectacles. Here, interest and policy, reality and ambition blended. He was able to tell the truth and at the same time to remind the general of their long association. He had been waiting far too long for his colonelcy, and this might be his chance at last. Perhaps his final chance. The major had been with the weapons evaluation team which carried out an assessment in Cairo following the Six-Day War. The general was his chief then, and the Russians had learnt a great deal from this field testing, in real war, of some of their arms. They had, in spite of the disaster to Nasser's arms, also managed to acquire from Cairo a few examples of new Western military hardware, and technical lessons had been learnt from those as well. Major Bakunin had been commanded by both President Pognoni and Marshal Zakharov when they went to Cairo and agreed to replace up to 80% of Colonel Nasser's lost equipment. In fact, it was Bakunin himself who had done most of the research work, and the general had got all the credit. And he could be useful to General Boris Kishneev, Inspector General of Ordnance, again. The opportunity of promotion had made him forget his rancor. Of course, Major Bakunin, this is a very different kind of war, more like the one carried out by the Americans in Vietnam. The general had only been in Kabul for 2 days. He obviously did not know very much about the Afghan operation, which put Bakunin, as the expert weapons man on the spot, in a strong position. He had been studying the campaign against the guerrillas. In a sense, Comrade General, you are indeed right, but I would like to suggest that this is far more a war of small ordnance, and that flamethrowers, mortars, and light and heavy machine guns, plus auxiliary equipment, will be the decisive factor. This interested General Kishneev, as Bakunin had known it would. He said, "But everyone in Moscow claims that it is the helicopter gunships which will do the job, as we learned from their tactical use by the Americans against the Viet Cong." Everyone in Moscow. This meant the people who supported Wings Against Stings, the air lobby which was always struggling with the gunners for primacy. Bakunin had prepared himself for this one. Tactical supremacy does not win wars, Comrade General, as I believe you once said in that important speech at the Polish Military College which was afterwards published in Krasnaya Zvezda. Bakunin was rather a creeper, thought Kishneev, and he did not get his facts quite right. Still, he might be useful in getting the Afghan anti-bandit weapons evaluation report done. And he did read Red Star, the Ministry of Defense newspaper, and remembered what he read, which showed that he was keen. Bakunin, at that time I also said that smaller weapons, mortars, automatic rifles, grenade launchers and flamethrowers did not win wars, but had to be harmonized in operation with the overall plan. Bakunin had been sent on ahead to do the basic study. How did he relate it to the general's doctrine? With respect, Comrade General, I was coming to that, for I think that it is your primary contribution to the moulding of strategic thinking. Primary contribution? Well, he might have an idea, let's hear it, the general thought. And the lunch at the military missions mess was not bad at all. You do a rather good borscht here, and the bread is delicious. Have another drink and tell me about it." No point, the senior officer thought, in letting the fellow imagine that he himself had no idea how an inspector of ordnance could actually influence strategy. Bakunin raised his glass. He had deep-set eyes, a mop of black hair, and the olive complexion of his Trans-Caspian forebears. "To the victory of the socialist camp and our fraternal aid to the peoples of the Marxist-Leninist nations," they drank. In the evaluation of the disastrous outcome of the Six-Day War, your summary, Comrade General, insisted that short-range, wire-guarded missiles should replace heavy guns for the tank-killer formations of the Egyptian army. The Egyptians pinned their faith and based their strategy on this doctrine. The result, though not a victory, was a significant loss of Israeli tanks, caused by the Egyptian Special Services and 7th Brigade. That's true. The 13-centimeter wire-guarded missiles did really well. This is excellent bread. No point in looking too keen. The bread is made from Soviet wheat, Comrade General, supplied to the Afghan government on the personal order of the President of the Presidium of the USSR. Soviet wheat? But Bakunin, this country is a rich cereal-growing one. What's Soviet wheat doing here, especially when we're having to buy grain from America? Bakunin searched his mind for a moment, arranging the correct words to explain. A lot of the standing crops have been destroyed in, operations. Farmers took up arms. They had to be punished. They are like our kulaks, rich peasants who hated socialism, who had to be liquidated. Then, of course, terrorists have burnt some fields to interfere with the land redistribution program. Then what do the people eat? A lot of the enemies of socialism starve, I understand. I certainly hope so. The general was a professional soldier who had been in the army since the Great Patriotic War against Hitler, since 1942 in fact, and remarks like that brought back painful memories. He sighed. "Carry on with your report, Major." Comrade General, the ground-to-air missiles and the MiG fighters and fighter-bombers are for national defense against invaders and so on. So is the heaviest artillery. Yes, I do know that, Major. This leaves among the rest the tanks and the helicopters, which in Afghanistan have a well-established role. Tanks can only move along certain kinds of terrain, and many get bogged down or cannot manage the mountain tracks. They are, therefore, of limited value, and there are separate reports for these two items in any case. Right, but continue. Now, we know that helicopters can be used against all kinds of targets, but as all armies have found out in counterinsurgency operations, at the end of the day the infantry must go in and flush out the enemy man to man, or at least with relatively short-range weapons. Exactly, Major. Bakunin was now getting into his stride. When, as in this country, the bandits move around and change their locations all the time, we use flamethrowers, light and heavy machine guns, mortars and grenade launchers and the like, all close-contact arms. Initially, when the Soviet limited contingent entered Afghanistan during December 1979, they brought with them hundreds of tanks and large aircraft. Experience has shown, however, that we can best root out terrorists by a swift descent upon them, using the smaller weapons. The formation of small combat groups is the answer to the Afghan situation. We are busy forming these now. They will change strategic thinking. We have already produced good effects in counter-terrorist actions. Yes, of course. The general was pleased. I would like to see something of such operations in the field. Could this be arranged? Then he thought he could use a telling phrase in his report, as I observed in the field." Bakunin hesitated, though only for a moment. "Everything can be arranged, Comrade General, and it will be my pleasure to do it. But it may take a day or two. The reason for this is that the political people do not like high-ranking officers, even anyone of field rank, to be too near a scene of action. There have been losses, senior officers killed, including 15 generals, and this makes good propaganda for the enemy." "Damn the political people, I'm here to do my job. I have a piece of paper from even bigger political people saying that I must be given every facility to complete my task." "Yes, Comrade General, I shall bring this to the attention of state security at the highest level. Colonel Sementsev is the man. Then, of course, we have to deal with Operations Command and Control." "And what about them? They're soldiers, aren't they? They carry out the operations, I watch them. That's all there is to it. It's perfectly normal, almost routine. I'm not trying to sleep with their wives, you know." Even fighting soldiers, he thought, seemed to be behaving like bureaucrats nowadays. "Understood, Comrade General, but we have had difficulties in the past. This is because operations does not like non-combatant personnel near a scene of action." The general's face went purple. "Non-combatant personnel? Son of an animal! Just you tell those fancy boys that I, Kishneyev, holder of the Order of the Red Banner and a dozen other medals for gallantry in action, was a fighting soldier, killing Germans when they were pouring out liquid from both ends of their bodies in their cradles. Operations. They don't know what an operation is. I'll show you something, little father." The general unbuttoned his tunic and pulled up his shirt. "What do you think this is, a love bite?" He showed the scar of an old knife slash or bayonet wound stretching from his collarbone to his navel. "This was done to me, to Boris Kishneyev, outside Kiev in 1944, by a Nazi panzer grenadier. And it was I, even with my guts hanging out, who turned that Germansky bastard into good-quality fertilizer. Operations." "Homage to the heroes who saved our mother Russia," stammered the major. "I'll make sure that Operations knows of this." The following morning, General Kishneyev, Major Bakunin, and a captain attached to them by Operations were standing on a hill overlooking one of the gullies which commanded the entrance to the Panjshir Valley, northeast of Kabul. The armoured personnel carrier was parked a short way off, with a black-haired, thick-set, smug-looking officer in it. He had been introduced as Colonel Sementsev, and he made sure that everyone knew he reported direct to the State Security Chairman. "I am reluctant, Comrade General," he had said when he joined the group, "to dignify a fly-swatting operation like this one against hooligans, with the presence of a man of my rank. I speak only of the dignity of the rank, not of the man, you understand. But I admit that the instructions are quite in order." The general disliked him on sight. Still, he knew the type, politicals dressed as soldiers, and they called them colonels, even generals. Moscow was crawling with them, and crawling was mostly what they did when they weren't bullying. But they had power, and could only be handled with an equivocal joke. And if that didn't work, kaput. And what about his own, very senior rank anyway? "It is a great advantage to have you here, Comrade Sementsev. I agree that things like this are a bore, and must be doubly so for a man of your distinction. Still, we all have to do things that we don't like. It's the penalty of honourable service. Let's just look upon it as a day out, like partridge shooting." Sementsev relaxed a little. He was a terrible snob, and he would be able to tell his wife that evening that, on a special mission, he had been hobnobbing with General Kishneyev, hero of the Soviet Union. He might even get the great man to lunch with them. That would be quite a coup. At the same time, he remembered with satisfaction that he was, in a sense, actually above the general. He had been told by Moscow to keep an eye on him. When people reached the rank of general, they sometimes said unwise things. Rank went to their heads, probably. There was that major general who had defended the Crimean Tatars, saying that they had been unjustly decimated and exiled by Stalin. Pyotr Grigorenko, that was his name. They'd had to put him in a lunatic asylum and fill him with drugs. That was the KGB. They had the power. And then they'd slung Grigorenko out of the country, out of the USSR. That was the KGB too. And all that remained of the entire Crimean Tatar nation was still in exile, somewhere in Soviet Asia. Now Grigorenko's voice was heard on the terrorists' Radio Free Afghanistan, slandering the Soviet Union. That proved he was a traitor. The four men were now looking through their field glasses at the countryside below. Panjshir, which means 5 tigers, had been one of the playgrounds of Afghanistan. Its beauty was such that people came from all over the world to see it, to swim in the rivers, to ski in the winter. Now it was the home of the infernal bandit Massoud and his ruffians. The huge valley in the Hindu Kush slashed through Afghanistan in an arc, from almost Pakistan to above Kabul. It was used as a guerrilla base, and as Bakunin's frank and indignant briefing put it, insolent interventionists and spies abounded. Doctors from France were actually treating the Afghan terrorists there, and making films about it and showing them in the West. But the night before, men of a Soviet motorized rifle division had treed some of the tigers. In a small group of caves near the town of Gulbahar, Spring of Flowers, commanding the valley's mouth, an advance party of Massoud's guerrillas had established a lookout post to warn of any approach into Panjshir by their enemy. The Russians and a contingent from the Afghan army were dug in here, trying to seal Panjshir off to protect Kabul, only 60 miles away. There were 12 of them, sent there by Commander Massoud to gain experience and to constitute his outermost patrol. This was part of their 2-weekly stint, after which they went to a remoter part of the valley for rest and relaxation, and some more basic training. Huddled in the caves, with no food, scanty ammunition, and no radio to warn their chief, the guerrillas looked down on the Russian troops below, and knew that they would never get away. They had, it is true, left a sentry at the bottom of the cliff where the caves were, but he had been surprised by a Russian PK of the airborne division in rubber boots and camouflage uniforms, who had then called up the riflemen. "There are 3 caves, and we estimate about 3 or 4 men in each," said the Afghan lieutenant, who, for appearance's sake, was in command. "How do you propose to deal with them?" "We're going to make this a letuchka, a short training exercise, Comrade General, to give as many men as possible experience of how to do these things. Starving them out would take too long, and using heavy artillery would be a waste of expensive shells. So we'll use mortars." "Right. Carry on when you're ready." Lieutenant Ablag saluted and did a smart about-turn. Until a week ago he had only been a senior corporal, but with the desertion of more and more Afghan soldiers, promotion was very quick these days. Anyway, he was a Kabuli, and it was better to go into the army and get somewhere than to be snatched from the streets by one of the press gangs and kept in the ranks until a mujahid bullet got you, or a knife in the back from some teenager in an alleyway. The Soviet troops had drawn back 300 meters, and a scruffy Afghan army mortar crew, some of them only 16 years of age, shuffled forward, reluctant, dropping things, spitting and cursing, looking at the Soviet general like dogs might at a vicious master, half fawning, half afraid of him. In the caves, The 12 men, 3 old, 5 middle-aged, and 4 who were little more than boys, had dug through the limestone, working all night, and connected their burrows. Now the 3 small caves were linked, they might just be able to think of something. Nobody knew what, but the digging had been something to do. For one thing, they needed only one lookout now, and the rest of them could take it in turns to sleep. The limestone had been quite soft, and the back of the largest cave was big enough to contain the material which they had dug out. The evening before, they had thought that they might climb out in the cover of darkness. It only took a few minutes to discover that this was impossible. Flooding the rock face with infrared light and using special goggles and image intensifiers, the Russians had been able to see any movement almost as well as if it were day. At dawn they had assembled, leaving one man on watch in the largest cave, while Feroz, their leader, served as prayer leader, facing in the direction which they supposed was that of Mecca. They took comfort from the familiar words of the congregational prayer. Glory to thee, O God, and thine is the praise, and blessed is thy name, and exalted is thy majesty, and there is none to be served besides thee. Then they went back to their places, lying on the cave floors, waiting for the attack. All ready to fire, General, sir. The Afghan lieutenant was back. Right, carry on. 3 mortars, 3 caves. The aim was so bad that 60 rounds produced nothing but holes in the cliff and pounded limestone. Emboldened by the conscripts' blundering, the guerrillas poured a concentrated hail of AK-47 fire towards them, putting them to flight, although at that range and angle the soldiers were in very little danger. A runner came up to the general, a piece of paper in his hand. Sending in the armour now, if you agree. He signed it yes, and went back to his binoculars. Below them, a specially adapted T-62 battle tank, its turret closed, edged forward towards the cliff face. In place of its 115mm cannon, it carried a strange apparatus, ending in a very ugly spout. The Kalashnikov bullets glanced off the thick armour plating, striking sparks and giving the group in the cave little comfort. Feroz said, "Hold fire. We only have one 30-round magazine left. Let's see what they are going to do." 15 yards away from the cliff, the Ognemetny tank stopped. Slowly, the long snout moved upwards to an acute angle until it was pointing directly at the center cave. Then, by telescopic action, it was elongated, became thinner, tapering to a point. A distance of 30 feet separated the snout from the cave. Feroz could see it clearly, the greatest of all horrors. "Atish Pash!" he shouted, and started to take aim. Before he could fire, however, the Atish Pash, the flamethrower, like some obscene hosepipe of hell, belched burning liquid death. Within a quarter of a minute, 8 of the guerrillas were reduced to smouldering ashes. A pall of oily black smoke drifted over the cliff top. The other 4, standing in their cave mouths and waving unrolled white turbans in surrender, and coughing, retching, climbed down the cliff face as prisoners. While virtually every other army in the world had discarded the flamethrower, the Russians still had uses for it. "Well done," said the Soviet major, who had not taken any active part in the operation. "But I wouldn't have started with such a raw mortar crew. They need practice. Of course, I'm only here as an advisor." "Fascinating," said the KGB man. "Let's see the prisoners now." The general watched the captives being rifle-butted forward, but said nothing. The 4 captives, 3 of them old, 1 very young, were ordered to sit on the ground as an interpreter appeared. The oldsters were wearing traditional Afghan dress, shirts over baggy trousers with turbans on their heads. The youngest, Aslam Jan, who was 15, wore sandals, jeans, and a zip-up wind cheater. He looked like the schoolboy he had been only a month before. They were all dirty, thin, and quiet. Their eyes glowed with fear, hatred, and exhaustion. "Have they said anything?" asked the general. "Nothing much." The interpreter, a thick-set townie, wriggled in his ill-fitting suit. He hated the job, but it was all he could get. Anyway, his wife and children would have suffered if he had refused to serve the army. It was a pity they had discovered that he spoke Russian. His parents had escaped from the USSR at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution and settled here. One Afghan prisoner spat as best he could with a dry mouth. The others did the same. Then they started to chant, slowly, enunciating the words carefully, looking straight at the Russian general. "And what does that mean, interpreter?" "Nothing much, Gospodin General." "It must mean something. Is it a religious hymn?" "They are only dogs, filthy ones, mushiks." "And they are saying?" "They are saying, Gospodin, death to socialism, long live free Afghanistan." "And what are you going to do with them?" The general turned to the KGB man. "I think they'd look nice hanging from that big tree over there, don't you, Comrade General? A sort of warning and an information piece. We used to send captured bandits to Kadi Panj, Afghan Secret Police Office 5, but they always died under interrogation there." "They don't have any rights as prisoners, Comrade Sementsov?" "They are not soldiers, they are criminals. Hanging them from a tree is justice. Assembling with arms is a crime under the Constitution of Afghanistan, and revolt against the state is a capital offense. State security has a blanket instruction covering all such positive cases. All is in order. A proper report will be made out, of course." He spoke quietly and patiently, almost soothingly, in much the same manner as a humanitarian official in the West might to an old lady who was objecting to the destruction of a rabid dog. The words of the official document of the Ministry of Defense of the USSR ran through the general's head. "The Soviet armed forces shall be ready at any moment to inflict a shattering, repelling blow against imperialist aggressors." The Soviet group lunched at the Sementsevs' large, sprawling villa, a Frenchified one built in the reign of King Amanullah Khan in the 1920s. Natalia Sementseva plodded back and forth, carrying bowls of fruit, shashlik, yogurt, bottles of wine and loaves of bread from the kitchen to the dining room. They had 3 servants, but she was more accustomed to looking after the entertaining herself. She was as fat as Vasily Sementsev was hefty, but that was why he had married her. She came from the Ukraine, where men, she thought, tended to be rather crude, and she was pleased that she had landed such a sophisticated husband. "I'm pretty high up in the state security already, Natalia," he told her when he was only a fairly junior clerk. "But I have prospects, you know." In addition to being a perfect civil servant, he had an uncle who supplied many of Moscow's high officials with fresh fruit and other delicacies from Azerbaijan. It was a good meal, but the general had taken a little too much Georgian wine. His face became flushed and he looked morose. "Never mind," thought Natalia, as she watched him sitting there glowering. "We are getting guests corresponding to our status at last, even if we are stuck in this mudhole called Afghanistan." "I see a man," the general was saying in a deep, growling voice. "A man with long hair and tattered clothing, covered in lice, howling at the enemy as he rushes upon him, a long knife in his hand. He is little better than an animal, with eyes blazing and murder in his heart. Comrade General, you have described these beasts, these murdering Afghan savages, perfectly, breathed Sementsev, delighted at the picture and revelling in the distinguished company he was now keeping. General Kushneyev wagged his forefinger at the KGB man. I have seen these men, Comrade State Security Committee Director, seen them many years ago. I saw them when I was serving at the front in the Great Patriotic War, when we drove the Germans back. I was 18 years old then in the Red Army, fighting for the motherland. Sementsev was slightly confused. Perhaps the general had drunk a little too much. Saw them, but surely there weren't any Afghan savages on the Russian steppes. No, they were not Afghan bandits, Sementsev. They were our own Russian partisans, our own guerrillas fighting for our land. And the fascists consumed them with flames, incinerated them with flamethrowers. They took many of them prisoner too, and then they hanged them, hung them on trees. People come to resemble their enemies, Sementsev. Natalia was biting her knuckles. She wasn't over-bright, but even this suburban housewife, who had just heard the recital of an encounter with evil terrorists, and then heard this equated with the heroic Russian resistance, knew that something dreadful must now happen. She braced herself, as if to meet a blow. Sementsev leapt to his feet, panting. His eyes were staring, his composure gone. For one wild moment he wondered whether this was a provocation, a test of his own loyalty. You had to be careful, after all. Recently the police in Moscow had been tested by Andropov's personal order. Squads of provocateurs had broken traffic laws and offered vodka to the police when caught. Almost all the vodka had been accepted, and no charges were made by the police. But then all the policemen concerned were jailed, to concentrate the minds of the rest. No, this wasn't anything like that, he was almost sure. The KGB's Third Directorate was responsible for army loyalty and for identifying disruptive elements. He must act now, even if it was only a trick. He took a deep breath. All present, his wife, Major Bakunin, and the captain were goggling at the general. But the older man's eyes were looking straight ahead, fixedly, as if watching some far-off scene. He hardly seemed to be there at all, as he repeated hoarsely, "Yes, yes, yes. Tactical superiority over the fascist enemy." "General Boris Kushneyev," Sementsev's voice was hysterical. "You are now under arrest. The charge is treason and slandering the people of the Soviet Union. You know as well as anyone else that we are not fascists and do not oppress the toiling masses of socialist Afghanistan. In Soviet law, all members of the armed forces of any rank are answerable to the KGB for any political statement." The general, looking at nobody, very slowly removed his belt with the gun in its polished holster, placed it on the table before him, and held out his arms as if for manacles. He looked up, his eyes mild as a baby's. "Comrade officer of the Committee for State Security, I feel happy now, contented. Better than I have ever felt since the liberation of the motherland after the Great Patriotic War. Do you, comrades, also know what it is to feel freedom and contentment, to have found a chance to do your human duty?" 2 hours later, his wrists in irons, General Kushneyev was led to an aircraft and flown to Soviet military headquarters Tashkent, en route for Moscow. Once there, he was sent for treatment to the Kazan Special Psychiatric Hospital, to become the 216th major dissident in mental care. When he saw the stamp of the Directorate of KGB Surveillance and Special Checking on the general's dossier, the head physician immediately filled in his diagnosis in the space provided. It read, "Formal diagnosis, schizophrenia caused by philosophical intoxication." Massive doses of haloperidol, specific for schizophrenia, are the standard treatment for this condition in the USSR. In normal people, it causes fear, insomnia, and physical rigidity. Those who have suffered its effects seldom recover from the horror derived from its generic name, butyrophenone madness. "Son of a pig! Spit that out! You're not allowed to eat before you are hanged!" The ancient guerrilla Anwar, a porter in earlier life, smiled quietly and took no notice. The Afghan security agent, there as a witness, so that all the forms would be correctly filled in, struck him on the head. The oldster smiled again and asked, "Does the brave policeman envy me my chew?" He did not have many teeth left at 74, and had been working on this morsel since he went into the cave 2 days ago. He had had nothing else except some water in his mouth. The security man wrinkled his nose in disgust as the starving man, thin as a stave, spat out a piece of motor tire. The official report said, "None of the terrorists would admit guilt, and all documents being in order, they were hanged at precisely 3 o'clock.